Bismillahir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and greetings from Morocco. Part of the treasury of Sufic writings that we can find in the Fons Vitae catalog are several works by the Moroccan Sufi and scholar Sidi Ahmad Ibn Ajiba. And because my dear friend Fuad Rasmuk and I had the blessing and honor of translating a number of those works, we thought we'd like to tell you a little bit about who Ahmad Ibn Ajiba was, and then a little bit about what he wrote. Concerning his life, we're very fortunate that among the books he completed, in fact in the last years of his life, was an autobiography which he called Al-Faharasa, published by Fons Vitae in 1999 under the title The Autobiography of a Moroccan Sufi. And if we find it a little incongruous that someone on the Sufic path, the path of self-effacement, should write an autobiography, he reminds us at the beginning that, quote, "It is a duty to proclaim the bountiful gifts of God," by which he's probably referring to the last verse of Surah 93 of the Quran, chapter 93, entitled Al-Duha, which says, وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ, and as for the blessings of your Lord, mention them. Be that as it may, he tells us in this book that he was born around 1746 in what I would call a rather amazing part of Morocco. That's the northeastern region, which is referred to as Al-Jibala, the part of the country that sort of juts up towards Spain, a land with coasts on two oceans, the Mediterranean to the east and the Atlantic Ocean to the west, merging in the Straits of Gibraltar and marked on the African side by this really striking-looking mountain, Jabal Musa, and on the Spanish side by Gibraltar. And it's these two very amazing-looking masses of rock that the ancients referred to as the Pillars of Hercules. On the Moroccan side, you have, between the two coasts, 13,000 square miles of mountains, hills, groves of cork oak giving way to pine forests, and even cedar forests at the highest altitudes, where the peaks become blanketed by heavy snows in the winter, which in turn feed into the springs and streams and rivers that seem to flow everywhere. This region is also extraordinary because besides being the rainiest and greenest place in this country, it seems to be a place where there's a very high concentration of spiritual energy, and where they say that for every spring in the region you'll find a shrine. And central of those is the resting place of the near legendary saint who is considered sort of the founder or the root of the Tariqah Shadiliyya, Wali Abd Salam ibn Mashish radiallahu an, whose resting place is located near the precise geographical center of the Jabal. So this was the region where Ibn Ajiba was born, as I said, around 1746, into a fairly well-to-do and pious Shibali family in a little village not too far from Tetuan. And what's particularly sweet in his autobiography is his recollections of his mother. Her name was Rahma, about whom he said, "She was eager to perform good works, endowed with a good and generous character, full of sweetness, pity, and mercy for all creatures, preferring them even to herself, and giving them what she possessed." He also mentions that all during her pregnancy with him, including through the month of Ramadan, his mother was constantly making this little prayer to God, "Allahumma arzuqni dhurriyatan salihatan." Dear God, grant me virtuous children. She also told him that as soon as he could talk or probably babble, whenever the prayer time came, he would say to her, "Qumi tusalli," قومي تصلي, get up and offer the prayer. And he would fuss and cry until she would finally bind him on her back and offer the prayer. He was apparently quite a gifted child and had memorized the entire Quran before the age of 10, which would mean at that time in Morocco, and to some extent at this time too, that he would be directed toward a life of the religious scholar, an alim, a life of books and study, a person who holds a respected place in the community, who might walk through the town in the beautiful white jalaba and have children and even adults come and kiss his hand. And by his mid-20s, he was well on his way toward that goal. But his plans would be changed in his late 20s, or maybe early 30s, when he came into contact with one book. One book changed his life. And actually, I wonder how many of us have had our lives changed by one book. In Ibn Ajiba's case, this book was Kitab al-Hikam, the Book of Wisdom, by Ibn Ata'illah, which he found at a friend's house and made a copy of for himself. And remember, making a copy in those days meant copying it out by hand, and so it was a long and at the same time meditative practice. And then he obtained one of the most amazing and comprehensive commentaries on the Hikam that existed in Morocco at that time, and that was the one by Ibn Abbad Rundi. Reading those two books was absolutely transformational for Ibn Ajiba. And by the end of it, he was ready to withdraw from people and spend the rest of his life near the shrine of Muli Abd Salam that I mentioned earlier. And he spent some days in confusion about this, whether he should go off by himself and give up his studies and everything else, or continue what he was doing. And it was finally a vision at the shrine of a saint in Tetouan that convinced him to persevere a little bit longer. But he writes in his autobiography, there's a quote, "When I returned to my studies, my mind was already oriented in the Lord's direction. My entire heart was with God. I took my place in the circle of students out of consideration for the sheikh who had ordered me to study, but I did not know what the teacher was speaking about, so occupied was I with the invocation of God." In short, he'd come to a point in his life where he knew that he had to, and this is how he puts it, move from knowledge to practice, to take that huge step when someone is ready to commit themselves to following a spiritual way. As it turned out, the possibility of fully entering a spiritual way didn't present itself to him for another 10 years. And during that 10 years' time, he became a husband and a father, and fairly well established as a religious scholar in the city of Tetouan. But then in 1793, he was on his way back from Fez, where he had been visiting some teachers, and he took a detour up into the Beni Zarawal region of the Jibala to visit the Zawiya of Sheikh Muli al-Arbi al-Darqawi. Sheikh al-Darqawi's spiritual order, what is called the Tariqah Shadiliya Darqawiya, by that time had become fairly well known in the Jibala region and beyond. And the visit that Ibn Ajiba made to Sheikh al-Darqawi resulted in him entering the order and being put under the guidance of Sheikh Darqawi's main representative in the area, Muqaddam, who was named Sidi Muhammad al-Buzidi, which in turn led to first a period of trials that lasted probably around a year, and by trials, this is what he calls them, it meant taking on sort of ever-demeaning tasks at the behest of the sheikh in an effort to sort of break the ego pattern that one had established already for oneself. That meant things like washing the clothes of the other fuqara, sweeping the souk, even begging in front of the mosque. At the end of that period, which maybe went on perhaps less than a year, another period of travel began, where he was bade by his sheikh to travel first in the region of the Jabala on foot with other fuqara, calling people to renew their faith and renew through the remembrance of God. And then beyond the Jabala region to the area of Rabat and Sali, which began a period of, again, 5 years, during which he was asked by his sheikh to begin writing and teaching those who were interested in the Tariqah. So most of the writings that have come down to us from Ibn Ajiba were done during that 5-year period, and all of the writings included in the Fons Vitae catalog were either begun or completed during that 5 years in the Rabat and Sali. At the end of this, he returned to his land in the Jabala, to a little village called Jimmish, not far from the village where he was born. The very end of the 1700s was a time when the plague reappeared in northern Morocco, afflicting the city of Fez in 1799 and causing hundreds of deaths every day. The disease spread north to Tetuan and the surrounding region, and eventually claimed the lives of several of Ibn Ajiba's children. And shortly after that, in November of 1809, Ibn Ajiba himself, just past his 60th year, succumbed to it. His final resting place is a humble domed structure a few hundred feet up the mountains from the ruins of his house. And it remains to this day a place of spiritual visit, as well as the site of a large yearly Mawsim, or spiritual festival, which attracts hundreds of men, women, and children from the region and beyond. Normally it takes place in August. On clear days, you can catch a glimpse of the Mediterranean in the distance, and that's a view which we can imagine the Sheikh must have looked out often as he completed his works, as he completed his writings, and he completed his journey. May God bless him and his family and benefit us by the teachings he left us.